I remember the first time I really saw Zanele, not as a person but as a fixture in my life. She was just another maid like the ones who had passed through my mansion before her, a quiet girl with careful hands and eyes that seemed too weary for her age. I had grown up surrounded by wealth, the sort of wealth that numbs you to ordinary life. Our Johannesburg house was built on excess, chandeliers that glittered even during the day, polished floors that reflected more than light, and a driveway that swallowed any sense of the real world outside. I was 16 when my mother passed, leaving me with my father, a man who measured love by the size of the inheritance he would leave behind. Our conversations revolved around business deals, social events, and maintaining the illusion that we were untouchable. There was little room for humility and even less for compassion. It was a world where the servants stayed invisible unless their failure disrupted our comfort. Zanele arrived on a Monday morning, carrying a small bag and a quiet dignity I didn't notice at first. Her uniform was neat, her shoes clean, her hair carefully tied back. She greeted the house with politeness as though she already understood the unspoken rules. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't look unless necessary, don't exist beyond your tasks. At first, I barely paid attention. She cleaned, she cooked, she moved silently, almost like a shadow that knew its place. But over the weeks, I started noticing things. The way she remembered my mother's favorite flowers and arranged them without being asked. The way she hummed softly while cleaning, a song I had never heard before but that somehow made the air feel warmer. And the way she never complained even when I treated her with the same arrogance I treated everyone else. It wasn't admiration I felt, it was curiosity tinged with guilt. I remembered a day when I had caught her looking at an old photo of my mother, the one where she smiled standing in the garden, hands dusted with soil, laughing at some private joke. Zanele had looked so small in that moment, almost lost, and yet she held herself with a kind of strength that I didn't understand. I had wanted to ask what she saw in that photo but the words stuck in my throat. That was the pattern of our lives. I would notice her in fleeting moments, her careful folding of clothes, the precision with which she arranged the silverware, the way she spoke to the other staff with patience I didn't possess, and then immediately retreat behind my arrogance. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself it was just duty, just my house, just my life. But every time I looked at her, I felt a prick of something I refused to name. I had grown into a man who thrived on status. People like me knew the right parties to attend, the right drinks to order, the right phrases to drop into conversation. Success for us was a currency heavier than money, it was recognition, envy, and admiration rolled into one. And so, when I heard about the invitation my father had received to the grand summer gala, I already began imagining the spectacle. Guests would arrive in gowns that shimmered under the Johannesburg sun, men in tailored suits boasting watches worth more than my first car. It was the perfect place to show power, charm, and a bit of wit. And yet, amidst all this preparation, a thought crossed my mind, a dangerous, mischievous thought. I remembered Zanele. She was always careful, always modest, always silent. What if I invited her to the gala? Not as a guest, of course, but as a spectacle. A poor maid in a room full of the city's elite. It would amuse everyone, and secretly I told myself it would amuse me too. I pictured the scene vividly, Zanele entering, carrying herself awkwardly, unsure of what to do, and everyone glancing at her with polite curiosity tinged with disdain. I imagined whispers behind fans and champagne glasses. Look at her, can you believe he invited a maid? I would smile quietly to myself, enjoying the discomfort, enjoying the power of the situation. And yet, even as I plotted, a small part of me, the part one ignored, felt the tiniest hesitation. What if she didn't look awkward? What if she surprised me? I pushed the thought aside. I had planned this carefully. The maid would be harmless, and her presence would only remind everyone how different our worlds were. The days leading up to the party were filled with my usual distractions. Meetings with colleagues, phone calls with investors, and the constant polishing of surfaces in my life that made the world seem flawless. I checked my suits multiple times, adjusted my hair, rehearsed small jokes I would tell. And in every quiet moment, I found my mind drifting to Zanele. Not her as she was, but as a tool for amusement. The morning of the gala, I watched her move through the house as usual, folding laundry, arranging flowers, and humming softly. She paused when she saw me, nodded politely, and returned to her work. I felt a pang of guilt I couldn't name. Just a little fun, I told myself, but the words sounded hollow even as I spoke them. I walked past her that morning, making small talk about chores and schedules. She answered politely with her usual calm, but there was a softness in her eyes that I couldn't read. And yet I didn't care, not yet. My attention was on the gala, on the guests, on the spectacle I intended to create. That night, the mansion glowed under hundreds of lights. Music drifted through the air, laughter mingled with the clink of glasses, and the scent of perfume, food, and wealth wrapped around every corner. I greeted guests with smiles and handshakes, laughter and witty remarks. And then, as the evening unfolded, I sent word for Zanele to be brought to the front entrance. When she appeared, I expected hesitation, awkwardness, uncertainty. I expected a quiet, humbled girl who didn't belong in this world. What I saw instead made my heart stop, though I didn't understand why. Zanele had transformed. She walked with a quiet confidence, her hair carefully styled, her dress simple yet elegant, every movement precise and deliberate. She didn't stumble. She didn't look unsure. She looked regal. And as she stepped into the room, the chatter dimmed for a moment, the gazes of the elite lingering on her in stunned silence. For the first time, I felt a pang of something I had never felt before. Not fear, not amusement, not pride, but a strange mix of admiration and regret. She didn't look like a maid, she looked like someone who had always belonged here, and yet was not defined by wealth or status. I realized then, with a clarity that startled me, that I had misjudged her. Every assumption I had made about her life, her grace, her intelligence had been wrong. And in that realization, a quiet fear settled over me. I had invited her to mock, but perhaps in her presence, I was the one who would be exposed. And as she smiled politely, acknowledging greetings from guests, shaking hands, speaking with warmth and ease, I felt the first stirrings of a truth I had long avoided. Zanele had always been extraordinary and I had been blind. The evening stretched on, the party continuing with laughter, music and whispered judgments. But in my chest something had shifted. The man who had plotted amusement, who had reveled in power and superiority, now watched in awe. The maid I had intended to ridicule had become the center of the room without effort, without display, simply by being herself. And in that moment, I understood that my life, my arrogance and my illusions of superiority were about to change forever. The night of the gala arrived with all the usual fanfare I had come to expect in my life of wealth and privilege. Johannesburg glittered beyond the windows, the city lights reflecting off skyscrapers, cars, and pools of wealth that seemed to exist in a separate world from the dusty streets I had occasionally driven past in my youth. My mansion, lit like a miniature sun, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the elite, music, laughter, and the clink of glasses. I checked my reflection in the mirror for the 5th time that evening. The suit fit perfectly, tailored to my frame, the cufflinks catching the light, the shoes polished to a mirror shine. My hair was styled just right. Every detail mattered. Every glance mattered. And every moment mattered because tonight I had a plan, an amusement I thought would be harmless, a small joke at the expense of someone I had underestimated for too long. Zanele had arrived earlier in the evening. I had instructed the butler to bring her to the front hall before most guests had mingled. My plan was simple. Let her stand there, confused, unpracticed, surrounded by grandeur she was not used to. I imagined the whispers behind fans, the polite smiles hiding judgment, the sharp intake of breath at the sight of a maid in a world she didn't belong to. I even pictured the small smirk I would wear as everyone glanced at her. But as she walked toward the hall, carrying herself with quiet poise, my heart betrayed me. I noticed the way her shoulders were straight, the way her gaze moved confidently across the room. She didn't shuffle. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look lost. And yet, she was not trying to impress anyone. She simply existed in the space with grace that immediately drew attention. I stopped myself from smiling too soon, from giving away the surprise I had intended. I had expected her to be nervous, out of place, timid. Instead, Zanele was the embodiment of calm, elegance, and subtle power. And as she nodded to the guests, greeting them with warmth and authenticity, I felt a strange twist in my chest, pride mixed with fear, amusement replaced by awe. The first guest to speak to her was Lady Mackay's, a woman whose reputation for haughty judgment was notorious. Lady Mackay's extended a hand, her tone polite but slightly condescending. "And who might you be, dear?" she asked, peering at Zanele's simple dress. Zanele smiled, a soft, disarming smile, and replied, "I'm Zanele Nkosi, sir. It's an honor to meet you." Her voice carried confidence but not arrogance, warmth without pretense. Lady Mackay's paused, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "Oh, how lovely. And are you here accompanying someone?" I stepped forward, forcing a casual laugh. "I invited her, yes," I said, trying to maintain the tone of amusement I had planned. But the words felt hollow. I looked at her, watching the subtle ease with which she handled the interaction. Lady Mackay's smile faltered. She hadn't expected charm, grace, or intelligence in this young woman. And in that moment I realized my joke had failed before it even began. As the evening progressed, more guests arrived. A few whispered as they passed Zanele, glancing at me, expecting me to share a smirk or a wink. I didn't. I couldn't. My thoughts were tangled in admiration, fear, and the uneasy recognition that she was no longer the girl I had once considered invisible. One of the more pompous guests, a man named Thabo, approached with a mocking grin. "Sipho, I see you've brought someone from home. A maid, perhaps." He chuckled, looking around for approval from his friends. Zanele looked at him directly, and I felt a jolt at the calmness in her eyes. "I work alongside Sipho on the community center project," she said, her voice steady. "I help run programs for women in the township. It's a privilege to be here tonight." The room went silent. Tabo's friends exchanged glances. The smile he had planned to share evaporated, replaced by confusion. And I, standing beside Zanele, felt a rush of pride so unexpected I had to grip the edge of the table. I had invited her thinking she would embarrass herself. Instead, she had silenced the room without raising her voice. I tried to focus on keeping the conversation flowing with the other guests, but my attention kept drifting back to her. The way she moved, how she spoke, the subtle gestures that made her seem both approachable and commanding. I realized painfully that my amusement had blinded me to her intelligence, her grace, and the power she wielded quietly. During dinner, she sat near the center of the room, conversing easily with dignitaries, women who had long experience in social work, and even a few journalists covering the gala. I watched as her smile remained calm, never forced, never exaggerated. She asked questions, listened carefully, remembered names. Every small action reinforced the truth. She belonged here not because of wealth, not because of privilege, but because of her character. And yet, I couldn't shake the fear rising in me. What if she realized I had invited her to mock her? What if she saw my intentions, my cruelty, my arrogance? I had always believed I could manipulate appearances, charm people into seeing the world as I wanted. But here, standing beside her, I felt powerless. As the evening wore on, a hush fell over the room. The music dimmed slightly, signaling the moment for speeches. I had planned to speak first, to make a small joke at her expense, to reclaim the attention I thought I owned. But as I watched her rise to speak, the words caught in my throat. She didn't hesitate. She didn't stumble. She didn't falter. Zanele's voice was steady, soft, yet commanding. She spoke of the center, its mission, and the women it served. She told stories of mothers who had struggled, children who had been overlooked, and the dignity that came from being seen and respected. Every word carried weight. Every phrase silenced the laughter, paused the whispers, and drew eyes toward her. I realized then, with a mixture of fear and awe, that the woman I had intended to humiliate had become the star of the night. Guests whispered among themselves, astonished at her poise and knowledge. Even those who had expected a spectacle of awkwardness found themselves captivated by her sincerity. After her speech, I felt a mixture of shame and admiration. I had thought I controlled the evening, that my status and planning would dictate the flow of attention. Instead, I was a spectator, witnessing the quiet power of a woman I had underestimated for too long. Later, as the gala wound down, guests began to leave, offering polite applause and murmured congratulations. I watched Zanele interact with each one, never faltering, never seeking approval, simply existing in a space she had transformed with her presence alone. I felt a shift inside me, a mixture of guilt, pride, and the first hint of something I couldn't yet name. Respect, genuine respect for someone I had thought I could mock. Finally, after most of the guests had gone, I found myself standing near the courtyard, watching her step outside for a moment of quiet. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming jacarandas. She looked up at the city lights, and for a brief moment, I saw vulnerability, a softness that contrasted with the strength she had shown inside. "Are you all right?" I asked, stepping closer. She turned toward me, a small smile on her lips. "Yes, I am. Thank you for including me." The words were simple, but they struck me harder than any speech, any applause, any wealth could. I swallowed hard, realizing the irony. I had intended to mock, to amuse myself at her expense, and yet here I was, humbled, watching her navigate a world I thought I controlled. I wanted to say something clever, something that would mask my surprise and admiration. But no words came. Instead, I nodded, silently acknowledging the truth. Zanele had changed the night, had changed my perception, and perhaps had begun to change me. As she walked back inside, I realized that my life, my arrogance, and my illusions of superiority had no place in the presence of her quiet strength. And for the first time in years, I felt a spark of something unfamiliar: humility, respect, and the slow dawning realization that this young woman had the power to change not just the night but me forever. And in that moment, I knew one thing with certainty: I had underestimated her, and the consequences of that misjudgment would follow me for the rest of my life. The gala had ended hours ago, yet I couldn't sleep. The echoes of laughter, applause, and whispered astonishment still lingered in my mind like a stubborn perfume. I lay in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the city outside my window reminding me that Johannesburg never truly sleeps. But I did, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of something I hadn't anticipated: Zanele. She had walked into that room with nothing but her dignity, her poise, and her confidence. She had transformed every eye, every judgment, and every expectation with nothing more than her presence. And I, who had plotted to amuse myself at her expense, was left reeling, humbled in ways I had never imagined. I remembered every detail: the way her eyes had met Lady Makaisa's with quiet authority, the subtle way she engaged Thabo when he tried to mock her, the small nods she gave to the journalists that made them pause and listen. She had commanded the room without needing to shout, without needing jewels or silk, and in that moment, I realized how utterly unprepared I was for the consequences of my own arrogance. I rose from the bed, restless, and wandered through the mansion. The rooms were silent now, polished surfaces reflecting dim light from the chandeliers. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked expensive. But nothing looked real. And yet, I felt a strange dissonance. I had spent years chasing admiration, respect, and power, and here was a young woman, once invisible to me, who had revealed the hollowness of it all. The next morning, I awoke to the soft sound of my phone buzzing. A string of messages from guests of the gala had already started circulating. Some praised the event, some praised the center, but many contained one recurring theme: Zanele Nkosi. The whispers of astonishment, the polite acknowledgement, even the veiled envy, all pointed to the same conclusion: she had stolen the evening without effort. I couldn't help but read each message with a mix of pride and unease. Pride because she had done exactly what I had secretly hoped for, not embarrassment but excellence. Unease because I knew the world I inhabited did not take kindly to someone like her commanding attention. She was a maid, I reminded myself. Or at least she had been. And now, somehow, she had rewritten the rules without asking for permission. I made my way to the center later that day. It was early afternoon, and the sunlight reflected off the freshly painted walls and the polished floors. Volunteers moved about, preparing materials for the next round of training sessions. Children played in the courtyard, laughing and chasing each other, their joy untainted by the world outside. And there she was, Zanele, walking among them, checking on every detail, her calm presence radiating like a beacon. When she saw me, she smiled faintly. "Good morning, Sipho. Did you sleep well?" Barely," I admitted, watching her hands as she adjusted a stack of papers. "I keep thinking about last night." Her smile softened. "I think about it too. But in different ways." I chuckled softly, though the humor felt strained. I didn't expect you to handle the gala the way you did." "I expected. I don't know, hesitation, nervousness, awkwardness. But you were remarkable." Her eyes held a quiet truth. "I wasn't there to be remarkable, Sipho. I was there to represent the work we're doing, the women we're helping. The rest is just noise." Her words struck me. She had stripped the evening of its pomp, its superficiality, reducing it to the real purpose beneath it. And yet, I couldn't escape the small pang of guilt in my chest. My intentions had been less noble than hers. My amusement had been cruel, and she had still treated me with patience, with grace, with dignity. The day passed with the usual flurry of activity. I stayed close to her, partly out of habit, partly because I couldn't tear my eyes away. I watched her interact with the women, listen attentively to their stories, and offer guidance that was firm yet gentle. I observed the children as they repeated instructions, their laughter echoing in the sunlit courtyard. And every time I looked at Zanele, I felt the small, unsettling realization that I had misjudged her completely. By evening, the staff had gathered for a debrief. We discussed the gala, the feedback from guests, and the responses from the media. Everyone was buzzing with excitement, praising Zanele's poise and effectiveness. But amid the applause, I noticed a subtle tension. Some of the older volunteers exchanged glances, whispering quietly about her rise, her influence, and the way she commanded attention. It was admiration, yes, but also envy. I recognized it because I had once felt it myself. Later, alone in the office, I reflected on the patterns of my own life. I had spent years relying on wealth, charm, and status to define myself, to manipulate perception, to control outcomes. And here was Zanele, a woman from a life far removed from mine, who had done something I never could. She had inspired respect without demanding it. The contrast was almost painful to acknowledge. I thought of the gala repeatedly that night. The way the chandeliers caught the light, the way the guests had paused when she spoke, the hush that had fallen over the room when she addressed the center's mission. It was humbling, yes, but also exhilarating. I realized then that my amusement had been childish, my arrogance foolish. And yet, I couldn't deny the small thrill I felt knowing she had captivated everyone, despite me or perhaps because of me. The following days brought a flood of social consequences. Word of Zanele's presence at the gala spread quickly, reaching my social circles, my business acquaintances, and even my father's old friends. Whispers, half sarcastic and half awed, began to follow me. "Sipho, did you see your maid at the gala?" some would ask, raising an eyebrow. Others would nod respectfully. "She's remarkable, isn't she?" Each comment was a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and judgment. I noticed the shift in myself first. I no longer looked at Zanele as a simple subordinate. My thoughts were tangled, confused, and persistent. I admired her intelligence, her grace, her strength. I feared her influence. I envied the way people responded to her. And deep down, I worried about my own heart, because I realized that I had begun to care in a way that made me vulnerable. One afternoon, Zanele and I took a walk through the nearby streets, a rare moment away from the center's bustle. The city felt different now, alive in ways I had long ignored. Street vendors shouted their prices, children played in the alleys, and neighbors greeted each other warmly. I noticed how people stopped to nod at her, smiled when she returned the gesture, and I felt a strange pride mixed with apprehension. "You've changed the way people see this neighborhood," I said quietly. She looked at me amused. "I don't change people, Sipho. I just see them and I remind them of what they can be." Her words lingered in my mind long after we returned. I realized that my world, the world of privilege, status, and control, was suddenly incomplete. Zanele had inserted herself into it not by permission, not by wealth, but by authenticity. And I was powerless to resist her impact. Back at the center, an unexpected visitor arrived. Thabo, the same man who had mocked her at the gala. He came with a thin smile, attempting to disguise curiosity as civility. I felt the familiar surge of protectiveness I hadn't acknowledged before. But Zanele handled him effortlessly, greeting him politely, explaining the center's programs, and guiding him through the rooms without ever losing composure. I watched, silently amazed, as he shifted uncomfortably under her calm authority. For the first time, I understood the full measure of her presence. She didn't just capture attention, she commanded it. And in doing so, she had begun to redefine not just my perception of her, but of myself. That night, alone once again, I realized that I was no longer the same man who had plotted amusement at her expense. Something inside me had shifted, fear, admiration, respect, and a quiet, undeniable attraction all coalescing into a restless energy I could not name. I knew one thing with certainty. Zanele Nkosi was no longer just my maid. She was something far more powerful, far more essential. And I had to find a way to navigate the consequences, both social and personal, of her arrival into my world. The days following the gala blurred into a mixture of excitement, tension, and quiet reflection. Every interaction, every whispered remark in my social circle seemed to revolve around Zanele. Some of the city's elite were impressed, others resentful. I began to notice subtle changes in how people spoke to me, as if my choice to include her had shifted the balance of my social standing. And yet, none of that mattered as much as the way she had altered my own world. I found myself observing her constantly, sometimes openly, sometimes in stolen glances. She moved through the center with a fluidity and calm I envied. She laughed easily with the women we helped, bending down to talk to children with a tenderness I hadn't thought I was capable of noticing. Every small gesture, every word she spoke, carried weight far beyond what she intended. And I felt both admiration and fear, admiration for her grace, fear for my own heart, which had started beating differently in her presence. That morning as I arrived at the center, I noticed a small crowd had gathered outside. Curious onlookers from the neighborhood, volunteers, and even a few journalists had come to see the woman who had captured attention at the gala. Zanele stood near the courtyard, her back straight, a gentle smile lighting her face. I felt my chest tighten, not from pride alone but from something deeper, something that caught me unprepared. "Good morning," I said, approaching her. "Good morning," she replied, her voice steady, warm. "We've had a few visitors already." Some are interested in supporting the programs. I nodded, taking in the scene. I had spent years learning how to command respect through wealth and influence. But here, it was clear that no amount of money, no connections, could replicate the way Zanele naturally drew people in. It was effortless, yet commanding, quiet, yet undeniable. As we walked through the courtyard, I tried to maintain casual conversation, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every detail from the gala. You handled yourself brilliantly, I said quietly. She smiled faintly. I did what was necessary, Sipho. That's all. I felt a surge of protectiveness I hadn't admitted to myself. No, it was more than necessary. You changed the evening. Everyone noticed. Even Thabo. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of him, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Let him think what he wants. I didn't do it for him. I did it for the women, for the center, for the work we're building. That's what matters. I wanted to argue, to tell her how remarkable she had been, but the words seemed insufficient. Instead, I walked beside her, silently acknowledging the truth. Zanele had power in her own right, and I was slowly learning that admiration for her could no longer remain hidden behind my arrogance. Later that day, as we reviewed the center's upcoming projects, I noticed a subtle shift in the volunteers. Some whispered among themselves, glancing at Zanele, exchanging looks that combined respect, awe, and a hint of envy. One of the older women, Mrs. Mbatha, approached me hesitantly. Sipho, she said quietly, I just wanted to say, Zanele is remarkable. She's changed the atmosphere here already. I nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. I know. I see it too. Mrs. Mbatha hesitated. It's just, some people might not like how much influence she has. I frowned slightly, feeling a protective surge. Influence? She deserves it. Don't mistake respect for a threat. The woman smiled faintly, but the concern in her eyes remained. I realized then that Zanele's rise was not just a personal matter. It was creating ripples in the social fabric, challenging expectations, and forcing people to reconsider their assumptions. That evening, I found myself walking her home, a small gesture, yet one I felt compelled to make. The streets of Johannesburg at dusk were alive with energy. Children playing in alleys, street vendors calling out prices, the faint scent of grilled meat drifting through the air. The contrast between our world of wealth and the neighborhood she had grown up in was stark, yet she moved through it naturally, as if she belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. You don't have to do this, she said softly, noticing my presence. I know, I replied. But I want to. I feel responsible, I suppose. For everything that happened at the gala, for the way people might see you, for me. She laughed lightly, a sound that eased some of the tension in my chest. Sipho, you can't control how people react. All you can do is be honest. With yourself, with me, with everyone. Her words struck deeper than I expected. Honesty. That was something I had never mastered. I had relied on charm, wealth, and influence to shape perception. But honesty, real honesty, was something Zanele demanded without even speaking it aloud. As we approached her modest home, I hesitated, unsure of what to say next. My mind was a whirlwind of admiration, guilt, and an unspoken longing. Zanele. She looked at me, calm, patient, as if she had expected the hesitation. Sipho, you don't need to explain everything all at once. Let actions speak. Words are cheap. Actions, they mean everything. I nodded, feeling both relief and frustration. Relief because her understanding was vast. Frustration because I wanted to express everything I felt, admiration, guilt, longing, regret, but the right words escaped me. The following week brought more challenges. Word of Zanele's performance at the gala had spread further, reaching influential figures in the city. Invitations to speak at events, requests for interviews, and offers of support for the center poured in. While I felt proud, I also felt an unfamiliar sense of insecurity. I had built my life around control, yet here was someone who could influence the world without wealth, without status, simply through presence, intellect, and integrity. One afternoon, as we coordinated a new training program, Thabo appeared at the center again. This time, he was accompanied by a few colleagues, his demeanor slightly more respectful, though I could still detect a hint of smugness. Sipho, he said, extending a hand, I wanted to see the center in action. Zanele approached, greeting him politely. Welcome, sir. Please feel free to observe. We have a few sessions in progress. I watched closely as Thabo followed her instructions, awkwardly navigating the space, clearly unprepared for the calm authority she radiated. I felt a quiet triumph, though I didn't dare smile too openly. This wasn't about me, it was about her. Later that night, alone in the mansion, I reflected on the events of the past week. My social circle was buzzing with talk of Zanele's poise, intelligence, and influence. The gala had become a turning point, not just for the public perception of her, but for my own understanding of who I wanted to be. I realized that my arrogance, my desire to control, and my reliance on wealth and charm were insufficient to navigate the life I wanted with her. For the first time, I considered what it would mean to truly respect someone, not as a subordinate, not as an amusement, but as an equal, a partner, someone whose presence could transform the world in ways I could never achieve alone. I also realized something else, more unsettling. I had begun to care for her in ways that left me vulnerable. My heart, which had long been armored with pride and ambition, now felt exposed, fragile, and exhilarated all at once. I was drawn to her intelligence, her grace, her quiet strength, and terrified of what that meant for me. And in that quiet reflection, I made a silent vow. I would not let my past arrogance define our future. I would not manipulate, mock, or undermine her. I would support, respect, and honor her, not because it would make me look better but because she deserved nothing less. That night, as Johannesburg slept beneath a sky full of stars and city lights, I understood that my life had irrevocably changed. The gala had been more than an event, it had been a revelation. And at the center of that revelation was Zanele Nkosi, a woman who had transformed my world with nothing more than her presence, her integrity, and her unwavering grace. And I knew, with a certainty I had never felt before, that the path ahead would challenge me in ways I had never anticipated, and that my growth, my humility, and perhaps even my redemption, would depend entirely on how I navigated it with her by my side. The weeks that followed were quieter than I was used to. I stopped going to the expensive lounges in Sandton, stopped buying suits I didn't need, stopped trying to prove that I belonged in rooms where everyone only spoke about themselves. I found myself craving silence, craving truth. Each morning before heading to the office, I would drive past my old neighborhood in Soweto. I didn't tell anyone. I'd park near the corner shop where my mother used to buy bread and watch the people. Children in school uniforms, women laughing by the stalls, the smell of vetkoek in the air. That smell, it carried memories that softened the hardest parts of me. It reminded me of my mother's voice, her worn hands, her laughter even when she had nothing. I had been so determined to erase those years, to act like they never existed. But now I missed them. I missed her. One Saturday morning I finally did something I'd avoided for years. I visited her grave. It was a quiet cemetery in Dobsonville. The grass had grown wild and I realized with shame that I hadn't been there since the funeral. My chest tightened as I stood before the small headstone. Lindayo Kumalo, a heart that served. I knelt and whispered, "Ma, I'm sorry." The wind moved softly through the trees. I stayed there a long time just talking to her as if she could still hear me. I told her about the company, about how I'd lost myself, about Zanele. I said, "You'd like her, Ma. She's kind, strong. Reminds me of you." A small laugh escaped me, mixed with tears I didn't try to hide. When I finally stood to leave, I noticed something that made me freeze. At the base of the headstone lay a small bunch of fresh flowers, roses still bright. Someone had been here recently. I asked the caretaker if he knew who left them. He nodded. "A young lady. Comes every few months. Always alone. Says she used to work for your mother before she passed." My mother never had many people around her. She worked herself to the bone for me. But then it hit me, Zanele had worked for her too. I drove straight to the foundation. I didn't even plan what I'd say. When I walked into the lobby, Zanele was at her desk, typing. She looked up, surprised. "Mr. Kumalo," she said, standing. "Everything all right?" I nodded slowly. "You used to help my mother, didn't you?" She froze for a moment, then looked down. "Yes." "I didn't think you knew. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because it wasn't important," she said quietly. "Your mother helped me first. When I first came to Johannesburg, I had nowhere to stay. She let me sleep in her spare room for 2 weeks until I found work. She was kind to me when she had almost nothing herself. I owed her that love back." I stared at her, unable to speak. She went on, "When she got sick, she wouldn't tell you. She didn't want to worry you. She asked me to keep it quiet. I visited her often, brought her food, took her to the clinic when I could. I was there the night before she passed. I felt the air leave my lungs." "You were with her?" "Yes," she said softly. "She made me promise one thing, that I'd remind you who you are if you ever forgot." My knees weakened. I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. My mother's voice came back in my head. "God hides blessings in ordinary faces." I had mocked the very person my mother trusted most. Zanele, I whispered, you've done more for me than I deserve. She shook her head gently. We all fall, Sipho. What matters is what we do when we stand again. Her calmness cut through me. She didn't speak with pride, she spoke with peace. And that made me want to be a better man, not for her approval but for the memory of the woman who raised me. That night, I went home and sat in my mother's old rocking chair. I hadn't touched it in years. The smell of her lavender soap still lingered faintly on the wood. I closed my eyes and whispered, You kept your promise, Ma. You sent her back to remind me. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind was full of memories, of childhood, of mistakes, of second chances. The next morning I called Zanele. There's something I want to do, I said. Something for my mother, and for women like her. She asked softly, What do you have in mind? I want to build a training center, I said. A place for domestic workers to learn new skills, to grow, to be treated with respect. I want to name it after my mother. There was silence on the line. Then I heard her voice break just a little. She'd love that. I want you to help me design it, I said. Not as an employee but as a partner. She was quiet for a moment before she said, Sipho, you've changed. Not enough yet, I replied. But I'm trying. When I hung up, I felt lighter. I didn't know where this journey was leading, but I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want to go back to who I was. That week, I began drawing the first plans for the Lindau Center for Women and Dignity. I put my best team on it, but this time, it wasn't about prestige or profit. It was about redemption. A few days later, Zanele walked into my office with some design notes. She wore a simple white dress, nothing fancy, yet she carried an air that made everything around her brighter. She looked at the sketches and smiled. You're doing something good, she said softly. For once, I replied, smiling faintly. She chuckled, then looked at me for a long moment. Your mother would be proud. Something in my chest ached at those words. I hope so, I said quietly. We stood there in silence for a while, two people who had walked through shame, loss, and forgiveness, and somehow found grace waiting at the end of it all. When she left my office that day, I caught myself watching her go, not with guilt anymore but with gratitude. Maybe this was what love was supposed to look like. Not passion or possession but peace. And for the first time in my life I wanted to earn it the right way. When I announced the plan to build the Lindau Center for Women and Dignity, I expected applause from my business circle. Instead I got laughter. At the board meeting, as I explained the concept, a training and support center for domestic workers, one of my senior partners, Themba, leaned back in his chair and said, Sipho, this is noble but you can't save the whole township. Focus on profits, not pity. Another added, chuckling, Bro, next thing you'll be washing floors with them. Let NGOs handle that charity stuff. Their words stung more than I wanted to admit. A few months ago I might have agreed with them. But now, sitting there in my expensive suit, I realized how empty their talk sounded. All they cared about was image while I was finally starting to care about people. I closed my laptop quietly. Gentlemen, I said, I'm not asking for your approval. I'm informing you of what I'm doing with my money. You don't have to understand it. The room fell silent. They stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, but it was a kind of madness I didn't want cured. After the meeting, I found Zanele in the foundation's office reviewing blueprints. She was sitting by the window, sunlight catching the curls in her hair. For a moment I just watched her. She had a way of being still but strong, like she carried quiet storms inside her. How did the meeting go? She asked without looking up. I sighed. They think I'm crazy. She smiled faintly. Then you must be doing something right. I sat beside her and looked over the sketches. You really believe this can work? I believe women deserve chances, she said. Your mother believed that too. Maybe this is her way of living again through us. Her words struck something deep in me. I reached out instinctively, then stopped halfway. Zanele, I began, unsure of what I even wanted to say. She looked at me gently. You don't have to explain. Just keep doing what feels right. That week, we started visiting communities, talking to domestic workers, listening to their needs. I saw the city through new eyes, the cramped rooms behind big houses, the tired faces hiding quiet pride, the laughter that survived poverty. Zanele moved through those places like light. Everyone knew her name, greeted her with warmth. She'd stop to hug old women, help children fix their shoes, speak with grace and patience. Watching her, I realized how far she'd come from the girl I once mocked, and how far I still had to go. One afternoon, while driving back from Soweto, she said softly, Do you ever think about that night? The party? I felt my chest tighten. Every day. I don't hold it against you anymore, she said. I think you were just lost. I glanced at her. You forgave me too easily. She smiled. Forgiveness isn't for you, Sipho. It's for me. Her calmness humbled me. I wanted to tell her everything I felt, that she'd become the voice in my silence, the reason I wanted to be better, but I kept quiet. Something about her deserved peace, not pressure. Over the next few months, construction began. I visited the site often. Workers greeted Zanele like she was one of them. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying her clipboard like a badge of purpose. The sight of her giving instructions under the hot sun made me smile in ways I hadn't in years. But not everyone was pleased. Themba called me one evening. Sipho, you're losing investors. They think you've gone soft. I answered calmly, if kindness is softness, then maybe the world needs more soft men. He laughed bitterly. You'll regret this, my friend. After he hung up, I stood on my balcony and looked over the city lights. I thought about how many years I'd spent chasing power, and how little peace it ever brought me. Now, working beside Zanele, every day felt meaningful even when it was hard. One evening, after a long day at the site, we sat outside watching the sunset over Johannesburg. The sky burned orange and gold, the wind carrying dust and warmth together. Zanele said, You've changed, Sipho. I chuckled softly. You keep saying that. Because it's true, she said. The man I met wouldn't be sitting here right now. He'd be at some fancy bar bragging about his car. I smiled. Maybe I finally got tired of pretending. She looked at me quietly for a moment. Your mother would be proud. Hearing that again made something in my chest ache and heal at once. I wanted to tell her she was the reason I could even think of my mother without shame. Instead, I said softly, so would yours. She smiled faintly but didn't answer. A few weeks later, the first phase of the center was complete. The grand opening was set for the end of the month. Invitations went out to business leaders, media, community representatives. I made sure everyone who had once mocked me would be there. The night before the event, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the last time I'd hosted a party, the humiliation, the shallow laughter, the guilt. This time, I wanted the air to feel different. Real. Redemptive. I picked up the phone and called Zanele. She sounded surprised. It's late, she said softly. I know. I just wanted to say, thank you. For what? For reminding me what wealth really means. There was silence, then a quiet laugh. Get some sleep, Sipho. Tomorrow is big. Yes, I said, smiling. But this time it's not about me. The day of the grand opening arrived, and I was more nervous than I had ever been in my life. Months of planning, sweat, and conviction were about to be laid bare in front of a room full of people. Some who had doubted me, some who had mocked me, and some who had never believed I could be more than a man obsessed with money and prestige. I stood outside the center, adjusting my suit, feeling the weight of the moment. The red carpet was rolled out, photographers were setting up, and a soft breeze carried the smell of freshly painted walls and soil turned into hope. Zanele arrived in a modest white dress, carrying a folder of speeches and plans. She smiled at me, and in that simple gesture I felt both ashamed and grateful. She had transformed from the maid I once mocked into a woman whose presence alone commanded respect and warmth. As the guests began to arrive, I noticed a few familiar faces, business partners who had laughed at my ideas, investors who had questioned my judgment, and some of Johannesburg's elite who looked curious and slightly skeptical. They expected a show, a charity gimmick, a man trying to look benevolent. They certainly did not expect Zanele. When she stepped out to welcome the crowd, the room fell silent. Her posture was poised yet approachable. Her smile radiated calm confidence. She greeted each guest personally, shaking hands, asking names, remembering faces, and listening with genuine interest. I watched her, realizing that she had the kind of grace that no amount of wealth or influence could manufacture. A few of my old acquaintances exchanged whispers. I caught snippets, "Is that the maid?" And I didn't recognize her. I felt a pang of guilt but also an odd sense of pride. She had arrived not to perform, not to seek revenge, but to simply be herself. And in doing so, she had stolen every ounce of attention, not by flaunting but by being authentic. When it was time for speeches, Zanele spoke first. Her voice was clear, warm, and unshakable. She told the story of the center, its purpose, its vision, and the lives it aimed to touch. She spoke about women she had met, mothers who worked tirelessly for their children, and the silent dignity they carried. Every word was met with silence, eyes widening, some guests even blinking back tears. I realized then that her authenticity had captivated the room far more than any grand speech or ribbon-cutting ceremony ever could. Then it was my turn. I stepped up to the microphone and for a moment I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my chest heavy. I looked at Zanele and remembered the young woman who had scrubbed floors in my mansion, the one I had invited to mock, the one who had quietly taught me humility without ever raising her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I finally began, my voice wavering slightly, tonight isn't about me. It's about courage. It's about dignity. It's about people who are often overlooked, yet carry strength beyond measure. Zanele has shown me what it means to be truly human. And this center is her gift to our community, and to our future. I glanced at her and she gave me a small, approving nod. That nod alone was more valuable than any approval I had ever sought from the people around me. As the ribbon was cut, the crowd erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause I remembered from my lavish parties. This was different, heartfelt, sincere, full of gratitude and recognition. I watched as mothers and children explored the center, their faces lighting up, and I felt a deep warmth in my chest. This was the kind of wealth that mattered. Later, as the event drew to a close, I noticed a group of my former business associates lingering near the entrance. They approached cautiously, their expressions a mix of awe and discomfort. One of them, Themba, cleared his throat. Sipho. I must admit I didn't believe this would work. I underestimated her and perhaps you as well. I nodded, feeling the old pride replaced by humility. It works because she is remarkable, I said, my eyes searching the crowd until they found hers. Not because of me. The guests slowly began leaving, but I stayed behind with Zanele, walking through the room she had designed, seeing the future she had envisioned brought to life. Children played in the corners, laughter echoed against the walls, and the sunlight poured through the windows like a blessing. At one point she turned to me and said softly, "You see, Sipho? The world responds to respect, not power. Humility, not arrogance. You've learned that, haven't you?" I swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes. And I have you to thank for it." She smiled faintly, almost shyly, a gesture I had never seen before. "We did it together," she said. "And it's only the beginning." For the first time, I felt hope for more than just business success or public admiration. I felt hope for a life that mattered. A life where people were more important than profit, where love was measured not by possession but by respect, where grace could change even the hardest hearts, including mine. That night as I walked home alone, I replayed the events over and over in my mind. The laughter, the applause, the stunned faces of those who once mocked us. But more than that, I remembered her, Zanele, the woman who had entered my world barefoot and humble and had transformed it forever. I knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. After the grand opening, life settled into a rhythm I had never imagined for myself. The center became a place of laughter, learning, and resilience. I would visit daily, sometimes just to watch Zanele move through the rooms, offering guidance, encouragement, and warmth. She had a way of noticing the smallest details, fixing a child's torn shoe, listening to a mother's worry, making everyone feel seen. I often found myself following her like a shadow, not because I was required, but because I wanted to be near her presence. Yet for all the peace I felt, there was a storm brewing. Not outside but within me. I had always believed love was about possession, about being admired, about claiming. But with Zanele it was different. She was untouchable in a way that both terrified and enthralled me. She had forgiven my arrogance, guided my redemption, and still I couldn't say the words I wanted, couldn't tell her what she meant to me. Meanwhile, whispers began to reach me. Old business partners, people who had once sneered at my charity work, started murmuring behind my back. "Sipho's gone soft," they said. "He's letting a woman run his decisions." Some even spread rumors that I was being manipulated, that Zanele had ambitions beyond her station. At first I was angry. How dare they judge her, the woman who had saved me from my own arrogance? But then I realized their envy revealed only my growth and her power, her quiet influence that commanded respect without demanding it. One afternoon as I sat in my office going over reports, I received a call from Themba. His voice was clipped, trying to mask irritation with civility. "Sipho, I hear the foundation is expanding the program and Zanele is overseeing your decisions." I leaned back, deliberately calm. "She's overseeing collaboration, yes. And doing it well." He scoffed. "Don't let her charm blind you, my friend. Not everyone who smiles is your friend. Some have motives." I laughed quietly, a sound filled with a mixture of amusement and pity. Perhaps. Or perhaps I finally know what it means to work with integrity and humility. Something you might have forgotten along the way. He was silent for a moment. Then he hung up. It was a small victory but an important one. I felt a strange pride, not in defiance but in knowing I was choosing the right path. Choosing people over power. Choosing Zanele over my own ego. That evening, the center hosted a community celebration for the first graduating class of trainees. Women who had once feared speaking up now stood with confidence, showing off the skills they had learned. Children danced, mothers laughed, and for the first time in years, I felt my heart swell with genuine joy. Zanele was radiant that night. She moved through the crowd like a queen, not demanding attention but earning it naturally. Guests whispered among themselves, astonished by her elegance and poise. I caught a few familiar faces from my past, people who had once dismissed her, watching her with wide-eyed admiration. I wanted to tell them to remember this. Her dignity had nothing to do with what I had given her, and everything to do with who she was. After the celebration, she found me near the edge of the courtyard. "Sipho," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you for trusting me, for giving this project life." I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. "No, Zanele, thank you. You gave me a chance to become a man I can respect. I don't think I would have found my way without you." Her eyes softened, and she looked at me longer than necessary, a look that stirred something deep inside me. I wanted to step closer, to reach for her hand, to tell her that she was everything I had been searching for without knowing it. But I stayed rooted, afraid that words might shatter the fragile balance between us. The next morning I received an unexpected visitor, my estranged sister, Namsa. She had not spoken to me in years, still bitter over old family disputes and resentments I had failed to heal. She stepped into my office, her arms crossed, eyes sharp. "Sipho," she said, voice tight, "I hear you're busy building centers and playing saint. Where does that leave your family?" I stared at her, heart hammering. She had always been difficult, but today I saw a different opportunity, an opportunity to extend the same grace Zanele had shown me. "Namsa," I said gently, "I've made mistakes, yes, but I'm trying to do better. Not just for me but for everyone around me. I want you to be part of that." Her eyes softened slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through the bitterness. For the first time we began a conversation, not about blame but about healing. Later that evening I found myself walking to the center, watching the sun set over Johannesburg. I thought about the paths that had led me here, the arrogance, the mistakes, the humiliations, and I realized that each one had been necessary. They had prepared me to recognize Zanele, to understand humility, and to finally see what it meant to love without ownership. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Zanele would ever feel the same way about me. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I could no longer live in the man I had been. And as I watched the city lights flicker on, one by one, I made a silent vow to continue this journey of transformation, guided by the woman who had once been my maid, now my teacher, my mirror, and perhaps my heart's only hope. The months passed quickly and the center was thriving. Word of its success spread through Johannesburg, reaching corners of the city I had never thought mattered. Women came from distant townships, eager to learn, to grow, to be seen. And every day I watched Zanele move among them with a grace I could never manufacture. Her presence was magnetic, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated authenticity. But not everyone celebrated our success. One afternoon I received a phone call from an old acquaintance, Sipho, a former business rival who had never hidden his disdain for me. His voice was sharp, full of thinly veiled malice. "Sipho, I hear the center is flourishing. That's surprising." I smiled faintly, keeping my voice steady. "It's doing exactly what it's meant to do. And you're welcome to visit anytime." He laughed, a low, bitter sound. "Don't get too comfortable. People like you, trying to play savior, always stumble. Especially when a woman runs the show." I hung up before replying, but his words gnawed at me. Not because I doubted the center or Zanele, but because they reminded me that the world I had once dominated still existed. A world that would never accept our transformation quietly. That evening we hosted a gala to raise funds for the center's expansion. I was nervous. I had spent so long in lavish parties, but this felt different. The atmosphere was genuine, no pretense, no arrogance, yet I could sense tension from certain guests. Among them were old investors and rivals who seemed eager to find a fault, to expose what they saw as a foolish experiment. Zanele was radiant that night. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant without effort. I found myself unable to look away. She was speaking with donors, listening, laughing softly, commanding respect effortlessly. And then I noticed it. Sipho had arrived, flanked by a few of his associates. Their eyes were fixed on her, evaluating, calculating. I felt a surge of protectiveness, a tension I hadn't known I carried. This was not about ownership, it was about respect. About ensuring that no one demeaned the woman who had transformed my life with nothing more than her heart. The gala began and speeches were made. Zanele spoke about the center, its mission and the lives it touched. She shared stories of women who had been invisible for years, now stepping into their power. The crowd listened enraptured. I caught glimpses of Sipho frowning, his smug composure faltering as the truth of her words sank in. After the speeches there was a networking hour. I stood nearby watching Zanele navigate the room. Someone attempted to corner her, questioning the feasibility of the center's funding. She handled it gracefully, her tone firm yet gentle, leaving the man speechless. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, not from jealousy but from awe. Later, Sipho approached me directly, his voice low. Sipho, don't forget, people like you never last. Charity is fleeting and women like her, well, they have agendas. I met his gaze calmly. Perhaps. Or perhaps people are just learning to see clearly for the first time. And as for Zanele, she doesn't need protecting from anyone, least of all me. But she does need respect, something you clearly forgot a long time ago. He looked taken aback, muttered something under his breath and walked away. I exhaled, realizing that confrontation had left me calmer than I expected. I didn't need to assert myself physically or financially, my loyalty and Zanele's integrity said enough. That night, after the gala ended and the guests had gone, Zanele and I walked through the empty hall. The chandeliers reflected faintly on the polished floors, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. You handled yourself well tonight, she said quietly. And you didn't even need to speak much. I shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. I learned from the best. She smiled faintly, a look that made my heart ache in ways I couldn't name. Sipho, you've changed? Not just in public but in here, she said, placing a hand gently over her chest. I can see it in your eyes. I looked down, suddenly aware of how much I wanted to reach for her, to tell her everything, how I had come to care for her, respect her, and admire her more than anyone I had ever known. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled with fear, humility, and reverence. Instead I said softly, "Thank you for trusting me, for showing me the way." She nodded, her eyes reflecting both pride and something I couldn't quite name. "And thank you for listening. That's the first step toward real change." We stood there, side by side in the quiet aftermath of a stormy night, knowing that we had survived scrutiny, envy, and doubt, not because we were perfect but because we were grounded in something real. I realized then that the biggest challenge wasn't the critics, the rivals, or even the city itself. It was me. My heart. My ability to finally confront the truth of what I felt for her, without fear, without pretense. And for the first time I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she felt the same way. The weeks after the gala were some of the most difficult I had ever faced. Success had brought its own challenges. Envy lingered in subtle ways, business associates questioning every decision, whispers that tried to plant doubt about Zanele's intentions, and the persistent echo of my own fears. Could I ever truly deserve her? One afternoon, as I was reviewing plans for the center's next expansion, I received a call from Zanele. Her voice was unusually quiet. "Sipho, we need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. "Of course. Where?" "Meet me at the site in the training hall." Alone. When I arrived, the center was empty, sunlight streaming through the windows. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, her usual calm replaced by tension I had never seen. "Zanele, what's wrong?" I asked, stepping closer. She looked down then back at me. "I heard things. People saying that you're doing this for me. That you're in love with me." My chest tightened. Yes, I am. But it's not just for you. It's for everyone here, for my mother, for me, for the life I finally want to live. But you're the reason." I realized it. Her eyes glistened, and for a moment, I thought she might walk away. "Sipho, I don't know if I can trust that. People have lied to me my whole life, used my kindness, manipulated me. I don't want this to be another one of those times." I felt the weight of my past pressing on me. Every mistake, every arrogance-filled decision I had ever made, every hurt I had caused her, it all seemed to converge in that moment. I took her hands in mine, feeling her warmth, feeling the life she had brought into mine. "Zanele, look at me," I said firmly. "I have made mistakes, yes. I've been cruel, foolish, arrogant. But I am not that man anymore. You've changed me. Not because I wanted to impress you, but because I saw the kind of person I could be with you in my life. I'm not asking for forgiveness only, I'm asking for a chance. A chance to love you properly, respectfully, honestly." She pulled her hands back slightly, tears sliding down her cheeks. Sipho, I've always respected you even when I couldn't forgive you. I've always seen the good in you even when you tried to hide it. But my heart, I need proof. Not from others but from you. Show me that this isn't just words. I nodded, swallowing hard. I will. Every day. For the rest of my life if I must. You're not just my past or my redemption. You're my future. And I'll prove it to you. For a long moment she was silent. Then she stepped closer, resting her forehead against mine. I want to believe you, she whispered. Her words, fragile and tentative, were enough to break through years of fear and regret. I pulled her into my arms gently, careful not to overwhelm her, and held her there, feeling the weight of our shared history melt away. That night we walked through the empty center together. I showed her the rooms I had redesigned to honor her vision, the spaces where women would learn and grow, the small touches she had suggested that made everything feel warm and welcoming. This is all beautiful, she said softly. You didn't just listen. You understood. I had a good teacher, I said, looking at her with all the sincerity I could muster. She smiled faintly, and in that moment, I felt something I had never allowed myself before. The pure, quiet certainty that I could build a life with her, not as a savior or a rich man but as a partner, a man transformed by love and humility. The next few days were filled with small gestures. I made sure she never had to feel overlooked or unappreciated. I sought her advice, deferred to her judgment, and treated her with the reverence she deserved. Slowly I could see her walls begin to relax, her trust deepen. One evening, as the sun set over Johannesburg, we sat on a bench outside the center, watching children play in the courtyard. I reached for her hand and she didn't pull away. Zanele, I said softly, I can't promise life will be perfect. But I can promise you this, every day I'll try to be the man worthy of you. And every day I'll honor what you've given me, the chance to see the world and myself differently. Her eyes glistened in the fading light. Sipho, I believe you. I want to try with you. And in that moment, as the city lights began to twinkle like stars below us, I felt a peace I had never known. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, had led me here, to her, to forgiveness, to love. It wasn't just redemption. It was the beginning of everything I had ever hoped for. The day of the center's official launch finally arrived. I woke before dawn, the city still quiet, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the usual rush of pride or anxiety. Instead, I felt something steadier, calm, purpose, hope. I arrived at the center early. The courtyard was buzzing with volunteers, staff, and women who had been part of the program from the beginning. Tables were being arranged, banners hung, flowers set in vases. The air was fragrant with anticipation, and for the first time, I understood that true wealth wasn't in the car I drove or the house I lived in. It was here, in the lives we were touching. Zanele arrived shortly after, wearing a modest dress and a smile that lit up the space better than any chandelier could. She moved through the crowd naturally, greeting everyone, checking details, and offering reassurance. I watched her, feeling a wave of emotion so strong I had to step aside for a moment. The woman who had once been my maid, the one I invited to mock, was now the heart of something magnificent, and she had carried it with humility, grace, and power. As guests began to arrive, I noticed familiar faces, former business associates, investors, city officials, even some who had openly doubted the project. I could see their surprise as they looked around at the center, at the vibrant energy, at the women who had transformed under Zanele's guidance. The silence was telling. Some were speechless, others visibly humbled. When it was time for speeches, I took a deep breath. I spoke not as a businessman, not as a man seeking admiration, but as someone who had been humbled and changed. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, this center is not just a building. It is a testament to resilience, to dignity, and to the extraordinary power of women. And it would not exist without one person, Zanele Nkosi. She has been the guiding light, the heart, and the soul of this project. I invited her into my life many years ago in ignorance, and she has remained in it in grace. Tonight, she reminds us that true wealth is not in what we own, but in what we give, nurture, and respect. Applause erupted. I looked at her, expecting humility, but instead, I saw pride glimmer in her eyes. She stepped forward to speak, and the room fell silent once more. Zanele's voice was clear, warm, and steady. She spoke about the women, the children, the families who had been overlooked for too long. She spoke of respect, perseverance, and the dignity that each person deserves. Every word she uttered carried authority and heart. I watched the room, seeing heads nod, eyes glisten, and a few guests even wiped tears from their cheeks. The very people who had doubted her brilliance now had no choice but to recognize it. When she finished, she turned to me. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw everything: forgiveness, trust, unspoken love, and the promise of a future built together. I walked toward her, heart pounding, and took her hands in mine. "Zanele," I said, my voice low but sure, "I don't know what the world expects from me anymore. But I do know this: I want my life to be with you. Not just as a partner in this work, but as the woman I admire, respect, and love. Will you let me?" Tears welled in her eyes and she nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yes, Sipho. I will." The crowd cheered, but I hardly noticed. Nothing in that room mattered more than the woman standing before me. The years of arrogance, mistakes, and mockery had led me to this moment, a second chance at love, life, and redemption. That night, as the celebrations continued, I found myself walking through the courtyard alone for a moment, thinking about my mother. I imagined her smiling down at us, proud that I had learned humility, respect, and the power of true partnership. For the first time I felt whole. Zanele joined me quietly. "You've come a long way," she said softly. "We've come a long way," I corrected, taking her hand. Together. We stood there, side by side, watching children run and women laugh, feeling the weight of the past lift and the promise of the future settle over us. I had finally learned that life isn't about wealth, status, or pride. It's about people, love, and the courage to change. And as we looked out over the city lights of Johannesburg, I knew this was just the beginning. Together we could face anything. Together we were unstoppable. That night, the world felt right for the first time in my life. Not because I had wealth, but because I had Zanele, and through her, I had learned the true meaning of dignity, forgiveness, and love.